The following presentation is brought to you through the power of science.
Ooh, shiny.
Welcome to Generations Geek, a more or less family-friendly celebration of all that is geeky. I'm science fiction writer Scott Pearson, and along with my daughter Ella, we are two generations of geek. This is episode 54, Hidden in the Shadows, our interview with Jaine Fenn, winner of the British Science Fiction Association Award for Best Short Fiction in 2016. We'll talk about her geek origins, how she got into writing, and her books, including her new novel, Broken Shadow, the second of her two-part Shadowlands series. Remember, you can find us online at generationsgeek.com, including blog posts from me and handy links from all our episodes. Plus, check out the Generations Geek Instagram, featuring Ella's geeky adventures. Now, on with the show. Jaine Fenn, welcome to Generations Geek.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a delight to have you. We're always happy to have on authors, and it's especially fun when we have authors on from across the pond. Although in this case, Ella herself is across the pond.
I'm here too.
Where do you live in the country?
I live in Devonshire, Devon, which is pretty remote from London. It's lovely, but it's quite quiet down here. I've just moved down recently, so I'm still getting used to the pace of life. It's definitely not as hectic as what I am used to. And I'm also one of the youngest people in this town, which is quite unusual. I think it's where somebody referred to East Devon as God's waiting room, which is possibly a little charitable. Yeah, I like going out for dinner. Sometimes we've been working all day, and a hard day's writing, and I think, right, let's go and find something nice to eat. 8:30, everything's closed. Everything's closed. It's just like tumbleweeds.
How did you get started as a geek? When did you first get grabbed by something in the sci-fi or fantasy genres?
Yeah, I'm of an age, and I think you may be of a similar age, Scott, where it wasn't even a thing. I grew up in the 1970s in rural England, not actually in Devon, in Buckinghamshire, but also far away from anything. Mm-hmm. And obviously the internet wasn't even a gleam in Tim Berners-Lee's eye at that point. So I had absolutely no contact with the genre other than what turned up on a screen. So it's the things that were on telly, which was obviously, we're pleased to hear, Star Trek,
mm-hmm.
Original series. I am that old. And that was on a Monday night, which is when I was meant to go to Brownies. So I wasn't having any of that because I wanted to watch Star Trek.
I love that.
I didn't really understand, but it was like, oh, it's okay. It seems to be fairly harmless. So that was actually one of the main things. The other two were more British ones. Jerry Anderson stuff, Captain Scarlet and Thunderbirds, which actually my brother and my dad also liked, which was great because I didn't know anyone else that liked any of this stuff, and they liked the gadgets. And also Doctor Who, which my brother liked, but he was younger than me, and therefore he was more scared than I was. So there was a little bit of sibling rivalry over its various scary episodes on that. There was an episode called The Green Death. I don't know if you heard that one. That one's John Pertwee. It's got giant maggots in a mine. And I have a distinct memory of sitting next to him on the sofa. And I had a cushion on my lap just in case. And he was already halfway behind the sofa. Well, it's not very healthy, really. But there really wasn't any sort of geek culture. There was nothing like that at all. It was just that I seemed to like some odd things on television. And then I go into W.H. Smith's, which was the only outlet for books that had all of one shelf of genre books. And I would buy whatever I could that was actually something I'd seen on the screen. Yeah. And that tended to be mainly Doctor Who. I was really proud of my Doctor Who book collection. And other than that, I've actually got a Thunderbirds record, now I think about it, and Captain Scarlet. And that would probably be worth quite a lot if my brother hadn't scribbled all over the cover. But he did. But there were never any Star Trek novelizations. And I can't help thinking that if there were, I would have got into science fiction a lot earlier than I did. Mm-hmm. And actual proper exploring space science fiction. I'm not saying that Doctor Who isn't science fiction, it most certainly is. But I think my tastes were shaped very much by what was available, as probably was true for you, I suspect, Scott.
Yeah, I had a similar childhood that I was in the 70s, lived out in the country, and Star Trek was my first real exposure to science fiction. I had the advantage of better access to Star Trek fiction here in the States, was stocked better than it was in your shop, it sounds like. And Doctor Who was never available when I was growing up.
Oh, no.
Because I was too far out in the country, but I didn't get to see Doctor Who until I was in college. So for me, it was all Star Trek, but then also the Avengers and Jerry Anderson's UFO. Those are things. Yes, UFO, yeah. Those are things that turned up somehow, maybe on the public television station, because our public television stations here in the States often carry, in the pre-cable days, that would be the station that would carry a lot of British television. So that's where I saw Monty Python's Flying Circus and Avengers and stuff like that. And this is an entirely different experience than what Ella has, where everything is available at a click. And
I
so
grew up with Netflix.
Spoiled for choice.
Yeah, it always just astonishes me, because I think of the days when I was growing up, when I would rush home after school because Star Trek was syndicated about the time in the afternoon. And then there were times when the local stations weren't syndicating it, and then there was nothing. There was no Star Trek. But now, when Ella was little, I was watching her like wandering around the house watching Star Trek on a pad. And, that was just entirely science fiction from my youthful point of view. So
I'm living Star Trek.
We live in the future. As I my partner, get some sort of new devices, something clever happens, or something stupid happens with technology. Like, we live in the future.
Yeah. So then, how did you continue to get into it when you had so little access to it? And when did that start? When did it turn to writing? When did you start writing genre?
I think I've always been a storyteller. So there is somewhere in the linguistics department of the University of Hertfordshire a tape of me, aged 5 years old, telling a Star Trek story about, if I remember right, a giant fire extinguisher that came out and put out the planet that was on fire. Makes perfect sense when you're 5 years old. So I didn't really differentiate between genre stories and non-genre stories at all. It was all stories. Yeah. When I was 7, I quote wrote my first novel, unquote, which I borrowed my dad's typewriter for. He was delighted when he was away. It was never the same afterwards. It was, I think, 4 pages long with a lot of Tipp-Ex with felt tip illustrations. And it wasn't genre. It was, if I remember rightly, called Fritz's Rescue, and was about a dog that rescued people. And that was, I think, because there was something pretty appalling, I think it was Disney, called The Rescuers that happened to be on. And then that way that you do when you're sort of, less than 10 years old, you soak up everything like a sponge. Yep. And when there's very much to soak up, then you make it all up. So that's what was going on there. But it wasn't specifically genre. Okay. And I didn't get into genre fiction until later, as opposed to genre tie-in fiction. And again, I remember clearly when that was. It was at a tourist attraction called Wookiee Hole, which is actually in the West Country near where I live. Stay with me on this. I went there and had a rather lovely day out. I like caves and waterfalls, and it had been a really great day out. I was with my dad, and we went to the bookshop / gift shop afterwards. And I always went to bookshops, even though I didn't tend to buy things I didn't know, because I was quite conservative, and I was just like, have I seen this on the screen? And they had face out a copy of A Wizard of Earthsea, and it was the one with Ged changing into Sparrowhawk, and it was like a kind of stained glass cover. And I just looked at that and thought, that's amazing. I want that. And I bought it. And I was slightly nervous in case it wasn't going to work out, because I had absolutely no idea what this story was going to be. And everything else I'd read, because it was tie-in, I was like, yep, know what to expect here. And it just blew me away. I'm really glad, actually, it's an Ursula Le Guin story is the first thing I picked up, because it could have gone badly wrong if it had been something I hadn't liked. Yeah. But it started at the top, really, with that, and didn't look back after that.
Okay, so as you were growing up, you were a storyteller, you loved genre fiction. Eventually, you got to university, and I'm very interested then in both ways. How did those interests in storytelling and science fiction influence what you studied in university, and then what has that stuff in university, how has that influenced your writing since?
I studied humanities because I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. And I ended up specializing in linguistics and astronomy because they were the most interesting two things. But before I talk about them, I think I should just mention what a revelation it was to find that there were other people in the world that read this stuff.
Oh, yes.
Genuinely do not think I had met another geek until I went to university. I was actually at school with Tolkien's granddaughter. And that sounds good. No, it's not as good as you think. So she was above me. She was really good at tennis, and she was horrible. I was reading Lord of the Rings, which I read and reread several times, and I had it flat on my desk during break so that nobody could see what I was reading because, I read these weird books. And she came in and she stuck her finger on it and she said, "My granddad wrote that." And I was just like, it's one of those moments when your childhood evaporates. Because I didn't really know. I knew her name was Tolkien. I thought, could she be the great man's granddaughter? And it's like she is. And she's horrible. So that was not a good moment. But when I got to university and there was a science fiction society, and pretty much instantly I fell in with Geeks. Within a few weeks, I'd met the geek I eventually married. It was great. It was just like this feast after a famine. And to be honest, the degree was, well, it wasn't exactly secondary. I did get through it, but I was way too busy having fun and finding out about the world, really, to study. But fortunately, they had subjects I liked. Linguistics, I'd like to have had a career that used linguistics. But the two careers that were open to me were advertising or journalism. Mm-hmm. And linguistics, certainly when I studied it, it was attracting the radical sort of anarchist types that were exactly what I needed. And by the time I left, I had come to hate advertising with a vengeance. I mean, I've had to write advertising copy occasionally to earn a penny since then. But at times, I am not doing this. I am not abusing language and making language to something to force people to buy stuff they do not need. Very moral high ground when you're in your early 20s there. So I didn't do that. I kind of wish I'd gone into journalism, but there would have been more training. And I also wasn't certain because I knew I'd wanted to write fiction, and I had an instinct that if I spent all of my words on non-fiction, I wouldn't have any left for my stories, which is probably complete rubbish. But I ended up going to IT basically because pretty much everybody else I knew was either an engineer or into IT, and I just fell into it. I could never have been a professional astronomer because I didn't have the maths, to paraphrase the late great. Yeah. Well, I really didn't have the maths because I went to posh girls' school. See further, Tolkien's granddaughter. They were, yeah. I mean, I liked it there, but they were not hot on the sciences, to put it mildly. And I was kind of steered away from science, which is appalling now. But in the 70s, yeah, it was basically a finishing school for girls that were going to marry young farmers. There was no career development. There was nothing like that. I did all the science that there was, but that wasn't very much. They did not, deep breath, teach physics at all. It wasn't until I went to do A-levels that I realized there was such a thing as physics. Yeah, wow. I know. That's a bit grim. So I had no scientific background. I'd done maths, but it'd been pretty basic. So I'd been put off maths, which is annoying because in my primary school, I was doing algebra when I was 9 and with a private tutor because they said I had a talent for it. But that kind of disappeared when I went to a school where that wasn't a thing. Mm-hmm. I guess shows you the value of education. So astronomy for a living was never anything that I was going to do, but I just loved studying it.
Ella, have you recovered from the Tolkien's granddaughter story yet?
I am still having an out-of-body experience. With you.
My wife and I were in London visiting Ella in February, and one of the great things that we did was Ella and I did a little walking around outside of Birmingham to some of the places where J.R.R. was in his childhood. And so we got to walk around and see the woods, the very Shire-like little woods that he played in as a child. It was fabulous. So so after you get out of university, when did you start pursuing writing as a career, or when did you realize that it could be a career? I mean, specifically the fiction writing.
I think I kind of assumed that if I was going to do a thing that earned any money, it would be writing. And the fallacy of money in writing. Ha ha ha! How naive are we? Because and again, this sounds really sad. I didn't really have any careers advice. I didn't really think I was going to have a career, but I thought, well, I can write and marry some young farmer and bring up his kids or whatever. And obviously, I've always wanted to tell stories, so I'll just do that. And then when I got to college and realised actually I could have a career and a life and all that stuff, then I thought, well, I'll be a writer. And I had absolutely no clue how to go about it. And I wasted way too many years not doing it. Well, I say not doing it. I wrote and ran a lot of role-playing games, a lot of tabletop role-playing games for my mates, because that was storytelling with a captive audience.
Yep.
They were there. You could write the stuff. You knew it'd be fine. Or you could write this story on spec, which you think is brilliant, and you could send it off to Interzone or Asimov's, and you get a form rejection. I think I'll do the thing with my mates. And that went on for about 10 years. So it took a very long time for me to actually pull my finger out and start learning the craft. It was always my intention, but somehow my intention got mislaid. Mm-hmm. So it really took a good decade or more, longer than it should have, for me to become a professional writer. But there was never any question about me writing anything other than genre. Why on earth would I want to limit myself? And that's the way I always respond when someone who's not in the genre says, why do you write this stuff? It's like, because I can write any story, set in any time, any place, doesn't have to exist. Why would I do anything else? Seems so obvious to me.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's the thing about this business is even if you study writing at university, which I did, my degree is in English. Even if you're learning how to write, and I took a lot of fiction writing classes, that's not really teaching you how to be a writer professionally. You get into this because you love telling stories, but it's all just by the seat of your pants. You stumble into things, you get a break here and there. So yeah, it's a very strange world. I do want to loop back. I'm curious, were you using Dungeons and Dragons when you were doing your tabletop, or what game?
I started doing RuneQuest, did a little bit of D&D. I mainly ran Shadowrun because I wanted the best of both worlds, so I wanted magic and tech. I read way too much Cyberpunk when it first came out, so I loved that. So Cyberpunk with magic, count me in. And also a bit of Call of Cthulhu, and occasionally some sort of odds and sods. Empire of the Petal Throne, Tecumel, don't know if you've heard of that. So, and that's a very weird fantasy universe, which I think may have influenced things I've done later. So it tended to be the things that were not, even by geek standards, some of them were quite obscure, which is probably not helpful, because I never got for this. I mean, I didn't do it professionally. Again, as you were saying, Scott, I had no idea how to do it. I did actually have a friend who was a professional games writer, and she kind of said, I could introduce you to some people at Chaosium, but they probably won't buy because it's basically a seller's market. And she was probably right. So, yeah, that aspect of it, I learned that bit of the craft. I mean, I didn't even have the advantage that you had of having learnt the craft of writing, of how to string a sentence together. Had there been a writing course other than the one at East Anglia, which I was the only one that was extant when I went to college, I would probably have jumped at it. But you're right that doesn't teach you how to be a writer. And it sometimes, I think, studying writing, some people I know that have got writing MAs, because I now teach writing, teach creative writing, and people that have studied MAs to that higher level, they can trot out all the rules and everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can tell a good story. That sounds terrible. I think it can kill the creativity, which is bad.
Then when you did first get professionally published, it was with short stories, right?
It was, yes.
And so how did that happen?
Well, I came up with the idea for the novel that became Principles of Angels in, I think it was about 1989. And at that point, I had left college and was kind of working at my horrible IT day job and escaping it by writing and running role-playing games, pure escapism. Mm-hmm. And I was aware that I didn't really know what I was doing. So I thought, well, I'll write short stories because I don't really know what I'm doing with this idea, even though I want this to be the novel. So that's why I started concentrating on them. And I basically waited until I had enough of a grasp of the craft to start writing something long. I was using short stories to learn the craft, and then I actually got people who knew what they were talking about to teach me, who knew. Only I'd thought of that earlier, at which point I thought, well, I'm actually kind of in the habit of short stories, and I do still love them. They are quite different to novels, but they are my first love, and I wish I had more time to write short stories these days, but I very rarely do unless it's a commission.
Yeah, once you break into the novel market, that really is a demanding place to be. And you've got that inertia where you would just want to keep that going.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're outside of a select few writers that have really made a name as short story writers for a bigger career. It's like novels really are the way to go.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, actually, because, of course, early 20th century, short stories paid better than novels.
Yeah.
They were, that was when 3 cents a word was good money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the stories that you worked on is related to your first series of novels. So when did you decide then to go from the short story and try to write a novel set in that universe?
I kind of wrote a really appalling, not even a completed short story with the central idea for Principles of Angels, which we may go on to chatting about later. And it was appalling. So I thought I need to work a bit more out about this place, mm-hmm. which is what got me writing the short stories. So my first published short story wasn't actually one of the ones set in in the Hidden Empire universe, but I enjoyed doing it partly as character studies and ways of working things out. And I still like doing that when I have the time. And I was always doing it with a view to the novel complementing the short stories complementing the novel. If the short story didn't work, well, it was still like a practice sketch for the novel. And that attitude served me well, I think. And I that's always how I am going to think. That's just how my brain is now wired, because that's how I started working.
So, Jaine, do you want to talk a little bit about how Hidden Empires started developing into the much larger series that it is? The
original idea that kicked it all off was, and this seems increasingly appealing these days, a democracy by assassination. Yeah, you can vote to have a politician who messes up removed, in inverted commas. And that was the original idea. And also the idea character-wise was, what if you had a character who is a professional assassin, because obviously they're state-sponsored assassins, who is asked to kill the person she cares about most in all the world. And now those two ideas are, 30 years old, and they came together, and I thought, I could do something with this if only I had some damn clue. And it took many years to do something with this, and quite a lot of short stories and a lot of false starts. And finally, there was a novel which finally did sell, which was largely a matter of luck, as these things often are. Mm-hmm. At that point, I think I'd had 3 short stories set in that universe published in various anthologies and magazines. So I had a bit of background going on. And of course, then you get the thing where if you are lucky enough to get a book deal, there's the, and what else do you have in the universe question? It's like, I don't know, give me a week. So it wasn't as hard, I think, as it would be for someone that hadn't lived in that universe and knew an awful lot about the background of it, mm-hmm. to actually come up with something. But I then had to come up with what is the next book. But I think also my extensive experience running really long labyrinthine role-playing games came in very useful, because meta-plotting, having a plot that actually goes through several books or several scenarios, kind of came as second nature to me. But at the same time, I realized the importance of making each book be a discrete story.
Yeah.
Because it does annoy me if I pick up a book and I think, this is great, it stopped. And I've nothing resolved. I'm fine with this is great. Oh, those things are wrapped up. Oh, but there's this other thing, at which point I'm hooked. Mm-hmm. So as a reader, that's what I wanted. As a GM, that's what I did. So when I came to write, and there's 5 Hidden Empire novels, there could potentially be more. There's none planned at the moment, but there could be nominally 9 of them probably. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be to do that.
So for over a number of years, you were working almost primarily in the Hidden Empire universe. Were you getting more interested in starting a new series, or did you just have an idea that popped into your head that didn't fit into the Hidden Universe? What was behind the start of the new books?
It was partly the vagaries of the publishing industry, in that series had it had come to a sort of end. There's more to come, but there wasn't a publisher for there any more to come at that point.
Okay.
So I did need to look for another idea. As you know, as professional authors, we write what we are told to write to an extent. But at the same time, it was quite nice to make a fresh start, because although it's great writing in an existing universe, you obviously have to be careful not to contradict your own canon. I mean, you write for Star Trek, it's just like, how can you do that when the canon is so big? It's only myself I'm contradicting. But it was quite nice to do a bit of a reset and do something that's very different, and that is a different subgenre, different characters, just... Mm-hmm. Although it turns out it's some of the same obsessions, who knew? But yeah, it was a refreshing change, and I wanted to just do something that was a bit off the wall as well, and that wasn't easily definable, because it's science fantasy, which is not fashionable, but I like it.
I don't think I mentioned the name. This is the Shadowlands series, and there are now 2 books out. And Ella, did you want to pop in now, because you've read the first book?
Sure, yeah. Is it a series or is it just the 2?
Well, again, it was one of those 2-book deals, and I would like to write more in this universe, but again, it's not necessarily down to me. Having said that, I have written a short story which is out later this year in it, because I just couldn't help myself.
Perfect.
But there's definitely more stories to tell. I'd like to get the chance to do it, I think, is the diplomatic answer on that one.
Awesome. Okay, well, if you were gonna sort of describe Shadowlands to our listeners who don't know what it is in like one sentence, what would you say?
Oh, I hate doing this so much.
You can push it to like 2, totally fine. But like, do you have like just one like ready to go?
Absolutely not. I really should do, shouldn't I? It is, well, the main thing is it's a divided world, which does appear to be one of my obsessions. So the original grain of the idea was, what if you have a world, and again, it is coming from my astronomy knowledge in a way that, even though it's science fantasy and not science fiction strictly, the Hidden Empire books really didn't, because I thought, what if you've got a world that is going around a class O star, which will mean nothing to anyone that doesn't know astronomy, but it's basically a hot young star. If you had such a world, it would be everything would be very fast. There'd be a lot of mutation. There'd be a lot of ultraviolet. What would it be like? And the answer is uninhabitable to humans, assuming that they can't terraform it. What would they do? Well, they'd either have to change themselves, or they'd have to do some sort of limited changing of the world. And that was basically the idea. And that's almost spoilery, because that's kind of never comes out in the books, because no one in the book has the faintest idea what the world is like. They just know they live either in the Shadowlands, which are moderately low-tech individual city-states, effectively, separated by the Skyland, which is inimical to humans, normal humans. But the Shadowkin, they are quite happy with their culture. It's quite a religious culture. It's low-tech because it's a low-iron world, which is also part of being a young planet in a young system. Mm-hmm. And the Skyland is just an alien place to them. But the Skykin, who live there, are effectively modified humans who are symbiotes with one of the native life forms. And I just thought, I can have a lot of fun with this. And I have, and I want to have more fun with it.
That was a perfect description. Thank you first. Okay. So you talked a little bit about how the Shadowland and the Skyland are kind of separate. How did that world building come along? Obviously, you've talked about the role-playing games and everything, but I found Hidden Sun very unique. I don't know if it's because I'm not reading enough science fantasy or because it just is. I think maybe a little bit of both. So how did the world kind of come together?
It wasn't too hard to do the Shadowlands world building because it is very similar to, fantasy standard-ish cultures, although the two Shadowlands you see are very different. One of them, I kind of had Italian city-states in my head for Shen, which is the Shadowland where things start off. Zect is a bit weirder. It's got some sort of Aztec influences, slightly Egyptian, slightly Chinese. It's got all sorts of things which are probably verging on cultural appropriation, but this is set a long time in the future, or in other words, so I can get away with it. They are recognisably human cultures, and also, more importantly, it's a recognisable human ecology because they've basically built the kind of things that we would have had on Earth because they had the facilities to do that back in the midst of time, all of which they've forgotten. The Skyland was a lot more challenging, but a lot more fun. So I always try and get real scientists to help me, and I had a real astronomer to help me, and I also had someone who is studied biology to a high level. So we assume that life has two biological sexes generally, and that they get it on, and that's how you get more life, and that's how DNA gets passed down the line. If you've got a very high mutation rate, that isn't necessarily the best way of doing it. So there are plenty of alternatives, and I had to think about those and talk to people about them, which include chimeras, where you've got basically a being that is multiple beings mashed together, and you've got colony animals where they exchange DNA freely and then go off and form a new colony and exchange a load of DNA with the others. So you're just going to get different life forms. I mean, I've kept some things the same, the whole kind of symmetry, the fact that it is DNA. They are recognizably alien. It's alien life, but it's recognizably life that we can relate to. And I did watch loads of David Attenborough programs to steal stuff from the real world. It's pretty bloody weird. And then just see how I could fit it into there.
That's awesome. I was going to ask if you also had like an interest in biology and botany along with astronomy because of the way the wildlife is, especially in the Skylands. So, for example, the Nightwings. Did you just like brainstorm with your science friends? Like, did you just sit down and be like, what if it was like a dragon but electric, and then also kind of a Dementor plus like a little bit of Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of them that way. I did study biology to A level, which is sort of just pre-college level, I think, and American standards, and I've kept up an interest in it. So I had a vague idea of what I was doing. I tended to come up with the ideas and then run them past people that might be able to tell me whether I could get away with it or not. Nightwings they're one of the sort of colony animals, so they are actually made up of lots of different things with different functions, but there is an overarching sort of pre-consciousness. One of the themes I keep returning to is kind of shared semi-consciousness or empathy and all that kind of lovely psi-power stuff. And there's a lot of that in Hidden Empire. Yeah, a lot of the Skyland creatures, they have not shared consciousness, but they have a sixth sense going on. It's almost a sense of smell that verges into a sense of mental communion. We have no words for this, which is fine because that means I can be pretty vague about it. And you have that to an extent with the Skykin, which makes them more than human and also quite alien. Which makes them very difficult to write. I've not written from the point of view of a full Skykin character because I've got to try and get my head around how that would work. Because it would be very alien, but also have some human connections. So I'm kind of working up to that.
We've talked about you studying linguistics and astronomy already, and a little bit about how that's influenced your work, especially like all the astronomy stuff in Hidden Sun. I guess I'm just curious as to how, like, I want to say almost like language diversity, but that's not it. When I was reading, I noticed in the Shadowland, they take like siestas and, but they also use the French word crèche, which I butcher because I never took French. And then, the names, like you said, in the Skyland especially have a lot of different, like varying inspirations. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that.
It's always tricky, I think, when you've got things that are recognizably Earth-like. What term do you use? There's this thing which you'll probably be familiar with, Scott. They don't call a rabbit a schmirp It's from the Turkey City Lexicon, which is a kind of writer's advice thing. Things in genre things to really just not do. Because if it hops like a rabbit, looks like a rabbit, and really is a rabbit, just call it a goddamn rabbit. So it's, and I've got two things side by side, one of which is very alien and one of which is actually very Earth-like. So, and because it's a cultural melange, the Earth-like one, I felt I could take terms that were, I mean, I think creche is quite a common term, certainly in this country.
It's used much more in England than it is in the States. I
think it is, and there was no real equivalent, because it's not exactly an orphanage, because they aren't really orphans.
Yeah.
Also, I quite like it's the associations with word, obviously. Yes, it's going the association with the creche as it being something which is quite enclosed and nurturing, but also a little bit alien. And words like siesta. There isn't another word for the day is very long, so we need to take a nap to get through it. So that's why that's ended up in there. So from the point of view of the terms that I'm using that aren't, quote, made up, it's thinking what fits it best in that culture. Loads of made up words in the Skyland, of course. There's a lot of them, rhino beasts and pichons and things where I've just had fun with them. But when I'm making up words that aren't portmanteau words, like rhino beast it's 2 English words, or when I'm making up names, I think one thing that studying linguistics did for me is make me hyper aware of sounds. Names are important, and I'm very conscious of having a word that to name something or somebody that sounds right. I always read all these things out loud. So I wanted, if you came up with a name, if you read a name for a character who's in one of the 2 Shadowlands, you should know which of the 2 they came from by the sound of their name. And that's important to me to do that. It doesn't necessarily impinge on other readers, but I'm kind of, it's not exactly an obsession, but it's something I want to do. I never really wanted to make up a full language because A, I'm lazy, and B, Tolkien already did it. And it's tempting to do it, but I just want there to be an implied extra level of something beyond English or whatever language people are reading in, which is just a little bit alien, a little bit different, which is why I try and be careful with my names.
I've had a fantasy novel idea for decades, and one of the things that has scared me away from ever trying to write it in a significant way is the language issue.
Mm-hmm. I don't think you have to do it now. I think fantasy has changed. I mean, I'm being quite ill-informed in this because I do not read a huge amount of fantasy. I mainly read science fiction, but I feel that fantasy has changed enough that it's wide enough now that you don't have to, but it can be fun if you want to. But of course, you don't have to make up the whole language. You just have to be consistent in your use of it. The second Hidden Empire novel is set in a world that is not entirely unlike part of the British Isles called Wales, which I love very much, even though it rains all the time. And I've borrowed Welsh words, and I've not had any hate mail from Welsh speakers because I've borrowed them and kept the meaning. So where there's something which is specific to this society, and it can be obvious from the context what I mean, I've used the Welsh word or a variation on the Welsh word. So I have nicked another language because I am really lazy. But you would only really have to come up with the words which are adding depth rather than saying the same thing again. If you see what I mean? That's how I feel. But obviously each to their own.
And Welsh, particularly to Americanize, Welsh looks like an alien language.
Like it too, quite often. I'm going to say Merry Christmas to you in Welsh now. Now, Dola Llawen.
Oh.
That wasn't Klingon, that was Welsh.
Yeah. I was going to say that there is a lot of similarities.
One of the protagonists in Hidden Sun, Rhea, is a budding scientist, maybe less budding and more actively scientist, although she doesn't use the word scientist. And she is doing that in a society that's very much sort of patriarchal. And I was wondering if her fight to be acknowledged as somebody who, she's also a very high status, her sort of fight as trying to be acknowledged as someone who knows what she's talking about and is capable was inspired by any real life experiences, even if they're a bummer.
The whole woman in a man's world thing. It's weird because I went to an all-girls school. So there was kind of no real male influence there. Then I went to a university that was mainly technical, so nearly all my friends were male. And I was oblivious largely of a lot of this stuff. And then I started writing science fiction. And the number of people, not so much my friends, obviously, because they knew me, the number of people then go, but isn't that for boys? And I just got very sick of that. Now, happily, our actual genre, we geeks, have caught up with this fact. It did take a little while, and occasionally you do still get people that haven't quite worked it out, that it's nothing to do with the disportation of your innards as to what you can actually write. Or as Pat Cadigan memorably put it when I was on a panel with her several years ago now, women write SF, get over it, boys. But it's not too much of a problem. I think it's still a problem outside of our genre. So, yes, there was an element of that. I'm also very aware with Rhea that I have not exactly cheated, but there is absolutely no way she could do what she does if she weren't a very high status individual, if she was if she didn't belong to the ruling class. It's a very class-ridden society, which is no good thing, but is an interesting thing to explore. And I was aware that I gave her that advantage because otherwise it simply wouldn't work. The second book has her kind of coming up against that a bit more with a character. She takes on an apprentice who is not of the same class, and it takes her a while to kind of realize that people can't spend all day watching a hive of bees and looking at their behavior because they actually have work to do.
And Rhea also, she makes a big discovery at the end of Hidden Sun. I don't know if you consider it to be a spoiler or not. And I was wondering what prompted you to have her discover that. It's sort of like this subplot that she's been studying the heavens.
It was kind of inevitable. Because the main sort of emotional arc is about her going after her brother and all the politics that's going on, but the science never stops being important to her. So almost while all these things are going on, she is observing, she is thinking, and she comes to a startling conclusion, which obviously you'll have to read the book to find out what it is, which is not actually that startling to the readers who'll go, yeah, that is in fact true. Well done on spotting it. But nobody else in the world realised it yet.
We're going to take a break from Hidden Sun for a second, at least a second. I read your bio on your website, and it said that on the weekends you like to live like a medieval peasant. And I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, historical reenactment. I don't do as much of it as I used to, and now I've moved to Devon. I've got to find a group down here, but it's one of my hobbies, of which I never have enough time to do. And it has many advantages. One, I get to make clothes. I used to be a cosplayer back in the day, a long time ago, before cosplay was even a thing. So I love making the clothes. I love history. I've done some research on it. I like camping, and I like drinking with my mates. And you get to do all of those things with a sense of self-importance if you've dressed up and the public are watching you, although you don't do the drinking until the public go home. I'd also done quite a lot of LARPing when I was younger, and I kind of, the LARPing, you actually get hit and you actually kind of run around and you have to be quite fit. You can do the reenactment, and you there is the combat aspect of it. I've got a very nice longbow, which my very trusting husband bought me for an anniversary present. So I do things. I do archery, but it's actually, you spend a lot more time cooking and eating food than you do chasing people around with weaponry, and I like that too. So yeah, it's a hobby I like. I haven't done it as much recently as I've wanted to, but it is one of those things that ticks a lot of my boxes.
That is the best possible answer. I was like, I really hope she says that she's literally doing historical reenactment, because I was kind of like, well, she's gonna say that she like eats lamb and lights bonfires or something, but that's
no. But I have actually got a proper medieval tent. And most of my group have proper medieval tents, and they're loads of hassle, but when they're up, they look great, and they're proper pavilion type things. But of course, the thing is, you also have to sleep in it. So most of them have got these beautiful tapestries behind which we've got like a little gas cooker and a comfortable chair and maybe an ice box. And the public does not see that. So whilst we are cooking stuff on a spit and talking about all this stuff and doing our embroidery, that's great. They go home, we break out the cold beers. It it's actually very funny doing it. The attitude that the punters, as we really shouldn't call them, have. Some of them are great. Some of them really engaging. It's now become more of a thing, and it's more accepted. I don't know, because you have Renaissance fairs.
Yep.
It's very similar to that, but the group I'm in is high authenticity. Not so high authenticity that you can't have an icebox behind your tapestry with your beer in. But while the public is there, for example, you can't eat anything that isn't authentic. And you have to, in theory, you're meant to talk, not obviously in ye oldie Englishy way, which is just, don't get me started on that, but you're meant to talk about subjects which would be relevant. And I, because I'm a role player, try and encourage them to do that and stay, quote, in character. But the boys mainly want to talk about the weapons, sadly. And the rest of us are just like, yeah, whatever. But you do get the public asking some daft questions. And it's normally, is that a real whatever? So is that a real sword, which it patently is? It's made out of metal. You can, there it is. Is that a real fire? Yeah, it's a real fire. It's not a hologram. And my favourite one was asked to one of my friends who just had a kid, is that a real baby? And she was,
oh my God.
So she turned around and went, no, it's a reproduction. I made her myself.
That's so good. So is it like, do you guys choose like a specific sort of century or like a specific year, or is it, because obviously Renaissance fairs in America are more like general?
Yeah, a bit of everything. The group I'm in is 14th century, and some groups do a specific year. There's something called Kentwell, which is Tudor, and they have a different year, and that's actually a static thing where you go to a house and you do live even more authentically in the period, and you take on characters from the period, and the public come to the house. The group I'm in, we go to basically have an excuse for the boys to hit each other with metal things in a field. I should actually say, some of the best fighters I know are female, but I am a coward and I can't run very fast, so I just stick to archery. Normally relatively safe because you can do it from the back. But yes, we have a period, and we stay in period in our materials, in foodstuffs and all that kind of thing. And I admit I picked a period that I quite like the frocks for. So I have an excuse to make them.
This brings up something that always amuses me. Americans will always use the phrase that someone has a British accent, as if there is just one accent. I mean, how many accents are native just to London on its own? So yeah, American Renaissance festivals, I love them. We have a really huge, well-established one here in the Twin Cities where we live that I've been going to since I was younger than Ella is now. It's been going for decades, and it's a lot of fun, but yeah, it is a more generic, let's have fun, acting goofily in period clothes.
Yeah. I mean, we have a lot of different kind of variations on it. There's the Society for Creative Anachronism, which obviously is an American thing.
Yep.
There's something called the Far Isles that got me into doing the reenactment, and that was very much about a bit of role playing, a bit of costume, a lot of eating, a lot of drinking, and sitting around and having fun. And it wasn't a public thing. And I do have a soft spot for that, but I quite like the fact you've got the public, because it gives you a focus to do it. It brings out the showman in me. It's quite nice to do that. We do dancing as well, which I'm very fond of. So you get to put on dance shows, medieval dance shows. So that's all good stuff. But yeah, I don't do as much as I used to. I must get back into it. Find a group down here. I actually probably find a group for a slightly different period, and then I'll have an excuse to make a load more frocks.
Oh, I love the Renaissance fairs in America because people who aren't like nerds will go. And then it's funny both to see the clash, but also then all of a sudden it's acceptable for me to show up in like this full costume, and everyone's like, oh, all right, like I guess Ella's ready. And it's like, I would love to talk more about the new book. Obviously, I've only read a few pages because I just want to, I didn't want to wait after I finished Hidden Sun. I was like, okay, I just need to read. I need to know where we are. And then I can.
Yeah, Broken Shadow takes place a couple of years after Hidden Sun. And the thing that Rhea comes up with is very important, certainly initially and all the way through. A lot of it is about the consequences of people's actions from the first book. I can't actually say a huge amount about it without spoilering. It's more of the same, and then it goes and does something unexpected. Yeah, that's all I can really say.
Yeah, it's very intricate. I noticed that when I was reading Hidden Sun, I was like, I can't talk about this without spoiling everything about, like, because everything is a surprise to the reader.
Excellent.
I talk a lot on our podcast about like, how much I love having like this initial block of like world building where you're like, okay, this is this, and like whatever, like explaining stuff. And obviously, like Hidden Sun doesn't really do that. Like the reader's sort of like learning as stuff happens. But you also don't have the excuse of, well, here's somebody who doesn't know anything about the world either, and so the reader like learns through them. It's just like you're just in it right away, and so everything is a surprise, and I don't want to ruin anything for anyone.
I make the reader work hard, and I do that a bit actually. The I call it I'm a stranger here myself is what I call it as a thing to teach, and it's a really useful thing. Of course, it's having a character from outside of a peculiar place who comes in as a stranger, and it's what they notice. Because, of course, Rhea does go to the Skyland, which she's always wanted to do, and so we do get it through her view. But because she is a scientist, her view is quite biased. The things she notices are not the things necessarily we'd notice, and I can only really talk about things she notices because we're in her viewpoint. But yes, that it hamstrings you, but at the same time, I like the challenge of that. Yeah, I do make my readers work quite hard to get to the bottom of the world, because I like, as a reader, to feel that I've made the effort and got to the bottom of the world.
Do you ever play text games?
Text adventure type ones?
Yeah.
Back in the day, I did a bit. This is a long time ago, and now it's more of a thing. I haven't really done any role-playing that isn't face-to-face for a long time. It's all been some tabletop and or freeform stuff. But I did some of those back when they were first a thing, and it was like one letter at a time appeared.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just curious because I have this app on my phone where I can play text games. I like it because in public it just looks like I'm texting, but really I'm playing a game. And there's a game that the protagonist is this woman who's semi-high up in like some political thing you don't really know, and she like one of the first things you do is like figure out how to use, I don't know if they call it a sight glass, but they like she's like use their but they're on elephants instead of rhinos. This is totally kind of off topic, but
that's just weird. There's nothing new under the sun or suns, so people have the same ideas. That's fine.
And I was reading Hidden Sun and I was like, oh my god, this is so exciting.
Synchronicity, that just happens all the time to writers. In fact, well, it happens all the time to everybody, but definitely happens all the time to writers, I find. When I'm working on something and I'm trying to get the ideas together, and I will keep seeing references to whatever it is I was thinking about, even if it's something that I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there'll be something, some piece of technology or some societal thing, something that is just like, I had never really thought of this before, and I've heard it mentioned once on the radio. I overheard a conversation, and look, there's one over there. So yeah, synchronicity, it's everywhere.
I know. I posted a couple of short little like 50-second videos on Instagram, and every time I do it, I like give myself a week where I don't watch any videos on YouTube, because I know that if I watch, one of my favorite YouTubers is like Jenna Marbles, and I know if I watch a Jenna video, then I'm going to edit it to make it literally a Jenna Marbles video.
Now that you've finished the second novel, do you have any projects that you're working on?
Well, I am actually working on something, but I can't tell you what it is.
That's okay.
Not exactly contracted yet, but I'm hoping it will be, being very vague here, and it's something completely different. And it's actually in somebody else's universe, and that is definitely all I can say.
Yeah. Oh, we understand entirely. Between my own writing and all my writer friends, Ella grew up listening to me saying, or other people saying, can't really say, but...
Yep. That must be very frustrating.
Yes.
It's more frustrating recently, which here's something we can talk about. Have you been watching Disco?
Oh, no. Disco and Discovery.
Yeah.
You see, I didn't even know it was called Disco now. Yes, I have. And yes, I do like it. Although it's definitely quite a weird redefinition of the universe. Now, I'm aware that you guys know way more about the universe than I do. I have watched pretty much all of the Trek except Enterprise, which I didn't get on with. And I do like Discovery, Disco, as I shall now call it. But he's way more into it than I am, and he knows way more about the universe. So he's like, oh, it's that was related to that. I'm going, okay.
Because of my job copy editing the novels, I had to be working on some of the first Discovery tie-in novels before the show was on the air.
Oh.
And so to make it easier for me to do that job, I was reading the scripts for the show before the show aired.
Oh.
And so, of course, I have all my non-disclosure agreements with Simon & Schuster and CBS and all that sort of stuff. But, of course, then Ella, who early on in her life became as huge a Star Trek geek as myself, there she was living in the house with a guy who knew all this inside dirt, who wasn't spilling any of it.
And it was even worse because it was like before anything aired, so all we had was like that trailer, and I was like popping up from around the corner, just like, who is she?
I usually don't think of myself as having a very good poker face, but I was forced to really up my game on my poker face because Ella would be guessing at things, and sometimes she was very accurate, and I had to make sure that I didn't.
When I got it exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, I had to not react at all.
I remember we were in the kitchen. I remember it so clearly, and I was like, she's Spock's adopted sister. I know it. And you were just like laughing, and I was like, I know she is. But I thought that was like too good to be true, and I was totally like, like I didn't think, like I had no idea that I was right at all until we watched like the episode, and I was like, oh my god, I knew.
I could just be vague at people I don't know all that well. I'm not like having a domestic situation where I'm constantly being tricked up.
Before we wrap things up here, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Did you want to mention any favorite books or movies or TV shows in the genre that you're currently watching? Or
book-wise, it tends to be whatever I'm reading at the moment. I forget about it. I really do need to do book spreadsheets as opposed to, because I always end up looking at all the books on my shelves and going, yeah, that was good, wasn't it? So book at the moment is Ken MacLeod, Corporation Wars, which is a post-human, post-singularity type book. It's about downloaded human consciousness and machine consciousnesses. But like a lot of Ken MacLeod's work, it is what I call sociological science fiction, which is my favourite. It's about societies and humans interacting, even though there are no human characters, technically speaking, in it. So I'm enjoying that very much. I've normally got a couple of books on the go. I've just finished something called The Kingdoms of Elfin, and this is a going back to my roots thing. It's by early 20th century writer called Sylvia Townsend Warner, and she wrote about. I mean, I love Fey Kingdoms and stuff. I've used all of that, and that's early influences. But she writes about the sort of classical land fairy, the wee folk, whatever, from an ethnographical point of view, from their point of view, as if they are the normal culture and we're the weirdos.
Oh, nice.
And it's quite dark, and it's very different, and it's just a whole. I kind of thought I got through my obsession with all that kind of stuff, but reading that I think, oh, I'd play with that. It might actually feed into the thing I cannot tell you about as well. So. So that's all good. So those are the books that are currently on the shelf or just on their way out. I don't know what we're going to read next, but there is a big to read. Actually, it's 2 shelves. Who am I kidding? 2 large big to read shelves. Watching wise, God, there's some good stuff around here. Talk about bread and circuses. I mean, whatever else you may say about this mad and crazy world, we've got so much good stuff to watch.
Yeah.
It's hard to know where to start sometimes. A lot of it as recommendations that I take from people. For example, I would probably never have watched The Good Place if several people hadn't recommended it. Because you look at that and you think, what? Really? But it's amazing. And there's nothing like
I mentioned that my degree was English, but I actually double majored, and my second major was philosophy. So I
did 1 year of philosophy, so yes.
Yeah, so as a creative writing / philosophy degree, then to watch The Good Place is just like, wow, this is just made for me.
Yes,
It's just
And
amazing work they do on there.
it is. I mean, how can something be educational about moral philosophy and also hysterically funny?
Yes, when
Yeah,
their enactment of the trolley car thought experiment.
Yeah. Also, I want a Janet. I really want a Janet. No, that's just, and I think it's one of those things that will stand the test of time because it's just I don't think there can be anything emulating it because it is just so unique. So that's definitely I think I'm completely up to date on that. Just finished watching season 3 of The Expanse, which obviously I love because space opera. And I read the first book almost sort of devoured it in not exactly one sitting because it's a long book. But my husband's read all of them, and I haven't simply because life is too short. I want to. I actually kind of want to break my leg or I'll do something that means I don't know. Something means I can't write for a while, and I'm just going to read the whole of The Expanse. But as a writer, you don't really get holidays, so and they're on my Kindle, just waiting to be read.
Yeah, I love The Expanse, the show. And then one day I was thinking maybe I should check out one of the books because I've enjoyed the show so much. But then I saw that they are all quite long, huge books. And so then I was like, boy, I just don't know if I'm going to have the time for that. But I love, broadly speaking, you can break science fiction into 2 groups. There's the, Star Trek, faster than light, artificial gravity. And then on the other end, there's something like The Expanse, which stays much more closer to real physics. And it's I love the Star Trek stuff obviously, but it's really fun to get into something like The Expanse where they really try to show zero G and micro G environments in a realistic way. And especially now that with CGI and stuff you can capture the feel of that so realistically without it just seeming like a bunch of kind of cheesy wire work. It looks more realistic. Ella, I don't think you've checked out The Expanse yet, have you?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun and really interesting. And I mean, and there are other aspects of it that are more science fiction-y, but it's all grounded in a much more realistic physical universe. So that's I can't wait to see what they do now with season 4.
Well, indeed. My husband's giving me like that. It's almost the reverse thing where I'm sort of going, so what are they going to do now that thing has happened? He went, wait and see.
Yeah.
He's like read all the books.
And they're sticking pretty close to the books, right?
Yes, he said. But what they've done is they've shifted some things around, introducing some characters at different times. But from what I remember of the first book, it certainly feels very similar. There's an interesting example of linguistics, by the way, in that, of course, with the Belter speak, their argot. And that's interesting to see that done in a science fiction environment. And it does seem to work as well. Particularly the character Naomi, who switches between her 2 dialects, the Belter and the mainstream one. So, yeah. I
don't know what a professional linguist would think, but to a layperson like myself, it seems like a very realistic extrapolation in, that if you imagine a few hundred years more of evolution of English under those living conditions, it seems very natural.
It's good that they're doing it. I mean, this is the linguist in me saying this. Now, I probably should have mentioned it earlier that I think we have to take a lot of shortcuts in science fiction and fantasy because realistically speaking, 50 years you'll diverge quite a lot. If you've got 2 cultures in 2 different environments, my Shadowlands really shouldn't be able to understand each other. I mean, they've got trade between them, and my worlds and the Hidden Empire shouldn't really be able to understand each other. I kind of impose there is an overall order, semi-religious in one case and kind of trade in the other. It means it's important that everybody speaks the same language, but people that don't travel between the 2 places would not speak in a way that someone from the other place would recognize, realistically speaking. And I know that that's unrealistic. So I like the fact, I mean, it is kind of lip service with the Belter argot, their dialect, because it would probably deviate even more. And it would also, I think, have a lot more idiomatic speech. There is some, but more idiomatic speech related to the environment that they live in, because that's how language changes in an environment, in the interaction with it. It's partly human interaction, but it's human to environment interaction as well. So, but I like the fact they tried to do it, and that's just an extra thing that makes the show really appealing to me. One of the things that is great about Star Trek, as opposed to other franchises that have to start from scratch, is that even if, as is the case, they're kind of playing fast and loose with the canon, they've got a reason to reset and that's fine and we're all good with it, you can be confident that they can come up with a plot arc that goes through several series because they'll get several series. We're thinking about things I've enjoyed recently, or even back in the mists of time. I mean, I like Stargate, but they were, and I don't think you guys have seen it, have you? Because it was one of those can't commit so much of your life to it, and I do get that. And I did like it that you did feel, well, they probably only had several series, one series, then two, then you've got to work out a new one. They did very well. Battlestar Galactica didn't. I was really disappointed in that. It was a reboot. It was an existing thing, although admittedly execrably bad in the 70s.
Yeah.
But I think, yes, wasn't it just? But don't ever go back and watch it, Ella. Just don't. But they did something with it. But then they kind of tried to tie it into what the original terrible 70s premise was, and they really, I felt, binned it. But the thing with Star Trek is you can be confident that whatever they do, you might not like all of them as much as each other. And I didn't like Enterprise because it was a bit corn-fed boy in space for me. Mm-hmm. But that's unfair, it turns out, because my husband's watched all of them. And occasionally he'd say, watch this one, you'll like it. And I went, I would like that. But everything in Star Trek, you've got such a solid foundation there. Yeah. Even if you are rebooting it, even if you are changing it, even if you are going somewhere else with it. And that just gives, I think, all of those shows such a confidence and such a believability that I will always watch them, even though I don't like all of them. I'll certainly try and watch all of them. But yes, I'm going to keep watching Discovery, yeah.
I really quite enjoyed the Battlestar Galactica reboot, but I went into it knowing that there was no way I would be satisfied by the ending because the foundation of the original show, with the sort of pseudo-Egyptian lost tribe thing, that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And there's really no way to make it make sense. But I understand why they felt that that was an integral part of the concept, that they had to keep it if they were going to call their show Battlestar Galactica. So even though I enjoyed much of the show, much of the journey, I knew that when we got to the ending, it would be entirely unsatisfying. And they made sort of an epic effort to try to somehow make sense but you can't make sense of it. It's nonsense. And so I really didn't like the last few episodes, but so many of the episodes on the way are so enjoyable. Yeah.
There was some great, and there's a whole lot of the whole, what does it mean to be human question, which is largely, I think, what our genre is about, asking that question.
Yeah.
There was plenty of that going on and plenty of intrigue and betrayal and all that lovely, tasty stuff. So, yes, I loved it. But I probably should have had your attitude, Scott. I probably should have known that at the end it really wasn't going to deliver. But they built up my hopes. And then I think the last half series, it's just like, oh, no. Particularly as they had Jimi Hendrix stuff and I like my music. It's like, oh, what are you going to do with it? Oh, really? That's what you're going to do with it? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's been great having you on the show. I look forward to when I get the time to read the books, and I'm going to make sure that Ella doesn't spoil them too much telling me about them.
No, I won't say that.
So thanks for coming on, and I look forward to seeing what that new project will be sometime down the road.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me on. This has been great fun. Thank you.
That's all the time we have for this episode. Find out more about Jaine at her website, jainefenn.com. That's JAINEFENN, jainefenn.com. And follow her on Twitter at Jaine Fenn. You can also support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Jaine Fenn. Tune in next time for episode 55, all aboard the Hogwarts Express, when Ella Skypes in from London to tell us about visiting the Making of Harry Potter exhibit at Warner Brothers Studio in Watford, and seeing Harry Potter and the Cursed Child live on stage in London. Remember that Generations Geek is a part of the Chronic Rift Network, which broadcasts from a small room beneath the stairs. Please give their other fine podcasts a listen at chronicrift.com. Thanks for listening, and come back next time. No geeks were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Ooh, shiny.